100 meters beneath the fields of southern Poland, there is a cathedral. It has chandeliers, staircases, altars, and life-sized saints, and every single one of them, floor to ceiling, is carved out of salt. Miners spent their entire working lives down there in the dark, and in their spare hours, over generations, they carved the rock they were digging into chapels. Which raises two questions you will not be able to unask. Why would men spend their lives 100 meters underground praying inside the thing they were mining? And why was that thing, the stuff restaurants now give away for free in paper packets, once precious enough to justify all of it? Right now, salt is very nearly the cheapest item in your entire kitchen. There is just one problem with the story you have probably heard, that salt was simply a seasoning, a flavor, a little luxury. It is almost entirely wrong. Salt was never really about taste. It was about staying alive through the winter. And by the end of this video, you will know exactly what that underground cathedral is, and why the pinch of white powder in your shaker built empires on 3 continents. It is the last week of November, in the year 1250, and you are standing in the frozen mud of your farmyard in the north of England, holding a knife you have just sharpened. The air stings your face, your breath hangs in front of you like smoke. Behind you, the byre, and inside it, 6 animals you have fed since spring. You can hear them shifting in the straw, and you have done the arithmetic a dozen times, because the arithmetic is your life. There is not enough hay to carry 6 animals through to April. There is barely enough for 2. So this week, the week your grandparents called Blood Month, you will slaughter the rest. Every farm in the valley is doing the same. The smell of wood smoke and blood drifts along the whole river, and the dogs of 3 villages have gone half mad with it. But here is the thing that keeps you awake, and it is not the killing. It is what comes after. A pig is a mountain of meat, and fresh meat, in a world without any way to keep it cold, begins to turn in days. A week, if the weather stays bitter. You cannot eat a pig in a week. You need that pig to last until spring, because the grain is measured, the cabbages are counted, and the months of March and April are called the hungry gap for a reason. There is exactly one thing standing between your family and those months. It sits in the corner of your house in a small wooden cask, and you ration it the way you ration nothing else, not even candles. Salt, coarse, grey, flecked with grit, and paid for, back in the autumn, with eggs and cheese you carried to market for weeks. You remember exactly what it cost. Everyone remembers what salt costs, the way people today remember what they paid for a house. Tonight, you will rub handfuls of it into cut pork, pack the pieces into a barrel between layers of more salt, and pray the cask holds out before the pig does. Too little salt, and the meat spoils quietly under the brine. You will lift the lid in February, and the smell will tell you your children's portions just got smaller. What you don't know, what you can't possibly know, is that the grey handfuls you are rationing tonight are, at this very moment, paying soldiers on one side of the world and funding an emperor's treasury on the other. You only know what your father taught you. Salt is life. Everything else is luck. So why not just eat fresh meat all year round? Because fresh meat requires live animals, and live animals eat all winter when nothing grows. Keeping a cow alive through an English winter costs more food than the cow is worth. That is the trap of the old world, and it is why your whole year bends around preservation. Everything you eat between November and April was killed, caught, or picked months earlier. And salt is what stands between all of it and rot. Salted pork in the barrel, salted butter in the crock, sealed under a crust of brine, salted fish hanging in rows from the rafters, stiff as roof shingles. Cheese, which is really just milk, that salt taught how to survive. Even the cabbages went into the crock with salt, pressed down under stones until they soured into something that would keep. Take salt out of this house, and the house starves by Candlemas. Winter is not the season of cold. Winter is the season of whatever you manage to salt. Sounds simple, right? Just get more salt, then. So why not simply make your own? If you lived by the sea, you might try. People do. They flood shallow clay pans at high tide and let the sun do the work. But you live in the north of England, where the sun is a rumor for half the year. So coastal salt here means boiling seawater, pot after pot, over a fire that never goes out. It takes something like a cartload of firewood to boil away enough water for a single sack of salt, which is why salt from the boiling houses costs what it costs. You are not paying for the salt, you are paying for the forest that was burned to make it. Inland, there is another way. A few blessed places where brine springs seep up through the ground, or where solid rock salt lies buried in seams. Towns grow on those places the way towns grow on rivers. You can read them on the map of England to this day. Nantwich, Northwich, Middlewich, wich, the old word marking a place of salt works. Whole settlements, whole road networks exist because of what is under them. Which brings us to the road. Twice a year, you or your neighbor walk 2 days to the salt market and 2 days back, because the cask in the corner does not refill itself. The road you walk has been walked so long by so many that it has a name and a toll, and men with carts pass you hauling nothing but white sacks, growing rich on the one cargo every single household in the kingdom must buy. The salt sellers know exactly what they are selling. Not seasoning. Time. A sack of salt is 4 extra months added to the life of a pig, and everyone on both sides of the bargain prices it accordingly. In lean years, you have seen families trade away tools, fleeces, even a breeding animal, mortgaging next year to preserve this one. Let that sink in for a moment. The dull grey mineral in your cask is not a flavour. It is the difference between a larder and a graveyard. Now, if one sack of salt is worth that much to one farm in one cold valley, ask the bigger question, the one a merchant would ask. What is salt worth to 10,000 farms? To an army that marches on preserved rations? To a city? To a king? Some very clever people asked exactly that question a very long time before you were born, and the answers they found built the greatest powers on earth. Step back through the door into the present for a moment, because you need to see how old this business really is. In the mountains above the Austrian town of Hallstatt, literally the place of salt, men were tunneling into the rock for salt more than 3,000 years ago, in the Bronze Age, with antler picks and burning pine torches. We know this in unusual detail because salt preserves everything, including, it turns out, the miners. In 1734, workers there broke into an ancient collapsed gallery and found a body, a prehistoric miner, crushed centuries before Rome existed, his skin, hair, and clothing cured by the very salt that killed him. They called him the man in salt. The mineral had kept its own casualty on file for over 2,000 years. The wealth of the graves found nearby, amber, ivory, fine bronze, gave its name to an entire era of European prehistory, the Hallstatt culture. Salt was buying luxury imports before anyone had written a word of European history down. Rome understood the business better than anyone before it. One of the oldest roads out of the city, older than most of the empire, is the Via Salaria, the Salt Road, running from the salt pans at the Tiber's mouth up into the hills. Roman writers tell us soldiers received a salarium, salt money. Whether legionaries were literally handed salt or simply paid an allowance to buy it, historians still debate. What nobody debates is what the word became. Every time you earn a salary, you are speaking Latin for salt. When you call a man worth his salt, you are auditing him in Roman currency. Even salad is in on it. From salted greens, the Roman habit of brining vegetables. The empire seasoned our entire language, and Rome grasped the political lesson early. Control the salt, and you steady the state. Officials manipulated salt prices to calm the populace in hard years, because a government that could keep salt cheap was a government worth obeying. Now go south, across the Mediterranean, into the emptiest place on the map. For centuries, camel caravans, hundreds, sometimes thousands of animals roped nose to tail, crossed the Sahara, hauling slabs of rock salt cut from the desert at places like Targaza, a settlement so saturated in the trade that when the great traveler Ibn Battuta, say it Ibn Battuta, passed through in 1352, he recorded houses and a mosque built from blocks of salt, roofed with camel skins. The slabs traveled south for weeks to the gold lands of West Africa, where salt was so scarce and so desperately needed that in some markets it traded for gold. At times, the chroniclers claim, weight for weight, white gold meeting yellow gold, gram for gram. The empires of Ghana and Mali rose on exactly this exchange, gold flowing north, salt flowing south, and kings taxing every slab that crossed their territory. Timbuktu, the fabled city of gold, was really a city of salt. The gold was just what salt was worth there. Let that sink in for a moment. A mineral that today costs less than the bag it comes in once moved in armed caravans and financed kingdoms. And yet the biggest operation of all, the state that turned salt itself into the treasury and ran an empire on it for 2,000 years, was on the far side of the world. 2,000 years before your November farmyard, China had already worked out what salt really was, the perfect tax. Everyone must buy it, rich and poor alike, every year, forever. In 119, before the Common Era, the Han Emperor Wu, say it Wu, facing the ruinous cost of frontier wars, nationalized the two commodities no household could refuse, salt and iron. Private production was folded under state license. The treasury took its cut of every grain. It proved so profitable and so controversial that decades later the court staged a formal debate about it. And the record of that argument, the discourses on salt and iron, survives to this day, 21 centuries of it, scholars against ministers, arguing about whether a government should profit from its people's dinner. The ministers won. They usually do. The monopoly outlived the emperor, outlived the dynasty, and in one form or another outlived almost everything else in Chinese history. Versions of state salt control persisted into the 21st century, making it, in all likelihood, the longest-running fiscal institution on Earth. For most of the next 2,000 years, in dynasty after dynasty, salt sat somewhere near the center of Chinese state finance. And in the late Tang era, by most estimates, the salt monopoly was supplying around half of the government's entire revenue. Half an empire, riding on the kitchen cask. The scale of the industry produced feats of engineering that Europe would not match for centuries. At Zigong, in Sichuan, salt makers drilled for underground brine, using bamboo rigs and iron bits, hammering percussion wells deeper and deeper through solid rock. They piped the brine through bamboo, and, in one of history's most casually astonishing details, they tapped pockets of natural gas from the same ground and burned it to boil the brine, using gas flames centuries before the modern world would even name the fuel. By 1835, one Zigong well had passed a full kilometer straight down, the deepest borehole on Earth, drilled by hand for salt. Europe's masterpiece of salt power was smaller, wetter, and dressed in silk. Venice began as a scatter of refugees on a lagoon with almost nothing to sell, except the one thing a lagoon makes beautifully, salt, raked from evaporation pans. Salt was the city's first fortune. In time, Venice graduated from making salt to controlling it. Its magistrates ran the trade through a dedicated salt office, and the profits helped bankroll the galleys and warehouses that made Venice the richest trading city in medieval Europe. The spices, the silks, the palaces on the water that tourists photograph today, the ladder to all of it had salt for its bottom rungs. A merchant republic, seasoned into an empire, and so serious about the trade that it fought its neighbors for control of Adriatic salt pans and ruthlessly undercut rival producers until buying anywhere else made no sense. Notice the pattern, because every ruler in this story noticed it too. Salt is the one product with no substitute and no opt-out. Whoever controls it holds a lever pressed against every single household at once. Rome steadied prices with it. China ran a treasury on it. Venice built a navy from it. But a lever pressed against every household has one danger built into its design. Press too hard, and every household feels it. On the same day, at the same table. And in France, the crown was about to spend 400 years pressing as hard as a state has ever pressed. The French called it the gabelle, and for 4 centuries it was the most hated word in the kingdom. The crown claimed a monopoly on salt and taxed it without mercy, but unevenly, province by province, so that a sack of salt could cost many times more on one side of an old boundary than the other. Worse, in the heartland regions, every subject over the age of about 7 was required to buy a fixed quota of taxed salt each year, needed or not. A purchase you could be punished for skipping. The state had turned winter's survival tool into a subscription you were born into. The predictable happened. Smuggling became a national profession. The faux sauniers, the false saltmen, hauled cheap salt across tax borders by night, with dogs, with children, with false-bottomed carts, and the state answered with fines, prison, the galleys, and for armed or repeat offenders, execution. In the years before the Revolution, thousands of men, women, and children were being condemned every single year for the crime of carrying salt. When the French finally rose in 1789 and the provinces sent their books of grievances to the king, hatred of the gabelle was scrawled through them like a signature. The Revolution abolished it within a year. Napoleon quietly brought it back to fund his wars, and a version of it survived, almost unbelievably, until 1945. France taxed salt from the Middle Ages to the Atomic Age. A century and a half later, on the other side of the world, salt broke an empire's grip a second time, without a single shot. In March of 1930, Mohandas Gandhi set out on foot from his ashram with a few dozen followers, walking roughly 240 miles to the beach at Dundee, where, in front of the world's cameras, he bent down and picked up a handful of natural salt from the sand. That was the whole act. Under British law, it was a crime. The colonial government held a salt monopoly and taxed every Indian's salt. Within weeks, across India, tens of thousands were arrested, by most estimates around 60,000, for making, carrying, or selling salt. No empire looks strong prosecuting a man for lifting a handful of its own beach. A pinch of white crystal had become the lever that moved the moral ground under the British Raj. And beneath all of these empires, under the taxes, the monopolies, the marble, there were always the miners, the people who actually went down for the white gold. In Poland, at Wieliczka, men worked the same salt deposit for some 700 years, cutting a maze of galleries that runs for hundreds of kilometers under one small town. It was brutal, dangerous, lightless work, rockfalls, floods, the constant dark. Being sent to the salt mines became, in half the languages of Europe, a synonym for a living death, a phrase you still use today without tasting what is inside it. And yet it is precisely those miners who left behind the most astonishing thing in this whole story. The thing this video opened with. We are almost back to it. But first, the strangest turn of all. The moment the treasure, that financed 20 centuries of empires stopped being worth anything at all. It took one idea and about 50 years, and it is the reason your salt costs less than the paper it comes in. Step back through the door one last time. It is the last week of November again, on the same farm in the north of England, but the year is 1900. The mud is the same. The cold stings your face the same way, and your breath still hangs like smoke. But listen, the buyer is quiet. No blood month, no knife. Some of the animals will simply be fed through the winter on bought feed, and the pig you do slaughter is no gamble. Because in the corner, where your ancestor rationed a small cask of grey salt like treasure, there now sits an open Hessian sack of clean white salt, bought for pennies, refilled without a thought. The railways did that. The geologists did that. Once they learned to read the ground, they found salt nearly everywhere. Vast beds of it under Cheshire, under Poland, under Kansas, the dried floors of vanished oceans. Steam pumps pulled brine by the ton. Vacuum pans boiled it with a fraction of the old fuel. The price of the white gold collapsed, and then refrigeration arrived and finished the job. The machine that makes winter on demand ended salt's 4,000-year monopoly on time itself. Here is the modern irony. Salt did not disappear when its empire fell. It multiplied. Today, only a small share of the world's salt, a few percent, is ever eaten. The rest feeds chemical plants and gets scattered, million tons at a time, onto icy winter roads. The substance men crossed the Sahara for, the treasure that funded dynasties, is now what we throw on the ground so commuters do not slip. Kings once died rich for controlling it. You now buy an entire year of it for less than a cup of coffee. And your doctor's only worry is that you use too much. Which brings us back down 100 meters under Poland to the cathedral. Remember the question from the beginning. Why would men spend their lives underground, carving churches out of the thing they were mining? Now you have the answer. Because for the miners of Wieliczka, salt was never a seasoning. It was wages and rockfall, food on the table and death in the dark. The substance that fed their families and buried their friends, sometimes in the same year. By most accounts, a handful of miner sculptors spent decades of their off-hours carving the great chapel of St. Kinga, altars, relief scenes, even the chandeliers, their crystals made of purified salt, so that men could pray before each shift inside the very material their lives depended on. They were not decorating a mine, they were consecrating the thing that ruled them. Now you know exactly what you are looking at. Not a curiosity, a monument to the 4,000 years when a grey mineral was time, money, power, and survival, all pressed into one crystal. Empires in Rome, China, Venice, and Mali were built on what your shaker holds. Revolutions in France and India were lit by it, and the whole colossal story now sits on your table, in a container so cheap you have never once thought about it, which might be the greatest proof of victory any substance has ever earned. The next time you pass the salt, you are handing someone the old world. If tonight's story made you look at your salt shaker differently, wait until you find out what the world's most polite drink did to the world's largest empire. The history of tea, the quiet leaf that toppled one, is waiting for you on screen right now. Go and open that door.